Okay, it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Lacey, who is a School Professor of Law, Gender and Social Policy at LSE. I am delighted one of the great benefits of being put in charge of guest seminars is that I can invite all my favourite people who I love to hear from. And I'm very excited to hear from Niki tonight. She's done some amazing work on criminal responsibility, on political economy, inequality and punishment, and so on. And she's going to talk to us tonight about institutionalizing forgiveness, interpersonal ideas in criminal justice. She told me that one of her favourite, the piece of work she's most proud of, is her wonderful biography of H.L.A. Hart, a legal philosopher. But I only discovered when I searched her to prepare my opening comments that she's also written a book on Maltlanders and Tesla Bills. So I found all sorts of literary interests that she has that I didn't know about. So I'm even more full of admiration than I was when I started. I'm really, really delighted that you're with us and very much looking forward to what you have to say.
So very generous. It's always a great pleasure to come to the Institute in Cambridge. I'm a bit of an old lag, so I've been here many times over the years. And Alice and I have been dear colleagues for a long time. And it's always special to come to this very wonderful institution, which of course has been so important in the history of the discipline over the last 100 years. So I'm going to talk about institutionalizing forgiveness in criminal justice, but I also want to put this in the context of a broader question about what is the role of ideas in the way we think about criminalization and about regulation and about punishment. And I'll sort of come back to that. So I'm going to switch back and forth. I hope this will be reasonably smooth between my script and a few more sort of autobiographical things about where this project fits within my work. So to start with, just a little bit of a background. I mean, this this paper is part of an ongoing project I've been working on with a philosopher called Hannah Pickard for some years. And it sort of came out of the fact that for quite a lot of the last sort of 20 years of my career, my criminal justice work has been comparative. I've been working on the comparative political economy of punishment. And that work is really very much geared towards situating the dynamics of punishment as a social institution within the broader political economy within which it exists and within the broader institutional framework within which political economies are embedded in different countries. And I'm still extremely interested in those topics. My work still within that genre, but I have also started to feel a little bit schizophrenic because the upshot of my argument, my comparative work, is actually a little bit, it verges on the dystopian, because if you are emphasizing, as I have, the way in which institutions like punishment are so deeply embedded in so many other systems, notably, of course, political system, that it's actually hard to see how we can intervene. You can just end up feeling a bit despairing about how we can make criminal justice work better. So the schizophrenic other bit of me thinks that we can definitely make criminal justice work better and that we need urgently to think about how to do so. And it's a particular pleasure, I must say, to be here doing this, where your prisons work, yours and Ben's, Alison and many other people here, has been so very focused on precisely understanding of how we can and should do things better. And I'm going to try and build in a bit of sort of dialogue between the more theoretical sort of work that both Leo and I have been interested in over the years, and the sort of empirical work that criminologists and other scholars have done. So the background is very familiar to all of us, which is the sort of proposition, and I guess David Garland's The Culture of Control would be a very good emblem of this, the sense that the criminal justice systems really are in bad shape, and that in a way they're possibly in worse shape than they have been for a very long time. And a particular focus, as you know, has been the upward drift in punitiveness. Now, obviously, we know that that has happened much more in some countries than others. We know also that there are many different dimensions of punitiveness, and that, of course, some of those dimensions are much easier to assess empirically than others. But I think most of us would accept that on many of its dimensions, whether it's imprisonment rates or the quality of prison regimes, scale and intensity of forms of non-carceral penal supervision, and of post-sentence disqualifications of one kind or another, the trend certainly in this country over recent decades has tended to be one, at least until the 90s, slightly rolled things back, of increasing penal intensity. Of course, it's been rationalised in various ways in terms of the need for deterrence or incapacitation, security, or indeed the imposition of offenders' just deserts. But the economic and human costs are troubling, and they're particularly troubling given the relatively, poor evidence about really the big decisive upsides of punishment. That's not to say that we can necessarily do without punishment, and I'll come back to that. And of course, one's concern about the worsening quality of punishment and its increasing scope is particularly worrying given what we know about the way punishment is patterned as a social practice. It doesn't hit all groups equally. So that sort of widespread critique of what's been happening in many criminal justice systems has had a whole number of different reactions. It's had a reaction at the level of civil society, and I'm thinking here at things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, leading, perhaps most famously in recent years to the call to defund the police in some parts of the United States. It's also led to a lot of sort of grassroots or sort of, let's say, sort of regionally emerging initiatives of various kinds. Therapeutic courts, drug courts, various kinds of mediation and restorative justice proposals and schemes right across the world. And there's also been an increase in sort of interest in thinking normatively about these issues. And I know that you've been studying some of these sorts of arguments in Leo's course. But the problem really is that, or one problem, one among many problems, is that there isn't always a very good dialogue between these different levels of concern with how to make things better. And in particular, I think sometimes the lack of much dialogue between some of the practical initiatives and some of the more sort of philosophical arguments about what we're trying to do when we punish and why we're justified in doing so has sometimes led to practical problems with the practical initiatives. So just to take a very concrete example, even if we take restorative justice, which is definitely the most sort of extensive and advanced genre in this search, there is still an awful lot of things on which there is unclarity or even deep disagreement. So, uncertainties, for example, about the role, meaning, and justification of shame as a dynamic in the relationship in psychology and penal ethics of restoration, and about the proper relationship between restorative and conventional criminal justice. And these things, I think, do take us back to some of the conceptual arguments in the normative part of this field. So that's really what I've been working on with Hannah. And Hannah is a very fine trained analytic philosopher, but she also spent a lot of her life as an NHS group therapist. And of course, she was working with people who, many of them, whom had, if I put it this way, a sort of fairly intimate relationship with the criminal justice system. And when I first met her, when I was working in Oxford, and so was she, about a decade ago, I started asking her about her work. And she was working in philosophy on a paradigm called responsibility without blame. And that's really, we've been trying to take that forward. And I'm just going to give you a very, very brief sort of summary of what we've been arguing, which is to give you the punchline, that insofar as possible, people engaged in punishment, like therapists, should try to keep affective blame, the sort of stigmatizing, angry, resentful affect that naturally accompanies blame, out of the penal process, just the way clinicians try to keep it out of the clinical process. And in more recent work, we've tried to push that forward in terms of this idea of punishment, rethinking punishment as oriented to forgiveness. What we haven't done so much so far is to talk about how to institutionalize that, and that's what I really want to talk about in this paper. But first, I will give, as I say, a sort of brief recap, very brief recap of Hannah's and my position, the story so far. And then I'll turn to, I think, an important question about how to institutionalize these ideas, including saying something about sort of the methodology here. Because one very obvious sort of skeptical reaction to the kinds of interest I'm articulating here, or some of the work Leo's done, other people who've worked on mercy, forgiveness, and these sorts of concepts, is the objection, well, that's all very well in interpersonal life, in moral life, but really you're talking about a sort of highly bureaucratic, professionalized institution with all sorts of different interest groups operating it. How can you institutionalize an idea that is a sort of fine-grained idea in moral psychology? And I want to say something about that. And then finally, I'll have a look at a range of existing features of criminal justice, which seem to me very open to reconceptualization and reorientation towards forgiveness, and conversely some examples. And it's, of course, unfortunately easier to come up with examples of existing practices which really would need to go. And then I'll just briefly at the end say a little bit about some further implications where I'd like to try and take this work in the future. Now, it has to be admitted, and this is going back to the other half of my schizophrenic, I've written on Jekyll and Hyde as well, so get the bigger. The terrain for reconstructing criminal justice in terms of forgiveness is at first sight deeply inhospitable. Needless to say, a big part of that is the turning up of the heat under criminal justice as a political issue, certainly from the late 1970s in this country. And it comes and goes. It does go up and down in terms of its position in social attitude scales and so on. But nonetheless, there is a real, very much was behind the turn to just desserts, the idea that we need to take crime seriously and do something penal by way of response. But I just want to sketch where we're coming from here. So Hannah's explanation of the basis of clinical practice with people who've engaged in a range of very harmful behaviours, often self-harmful as well as harmful to others, suggests that perhaps reformers influenced by the critique, well-known critiques of the so-called determinism of rehabilitation ideals, have been a bit hasty and have sort of thrown out the baby with the bathwater, as we might say. The baby being behavioural change, which is definitely something we do want to see. So, in fact, Picard argues, not only is clinical practice compatible with agency, so we don't give up a focus on agency and responsibility when we draw the analogy between the clinic and the courtroom, because in clinical work, it's actually crucial to work with agency. You can't actually work with anybody towards change if you don't engage their sense of responsibility for themselves and their sense, as Shad Maruna has put it, that they can have a redemption script, that there is a possibility of change, that they have a capacity of redemption in terms of, so that you're basically engaging with them on the basis that they've done something wrongful or harmful, but not on the basis that they're a bad person. If, as a therapist or another kind of clinician, you allow that sort of affect into your practice, anger, contempt, hostility, that impedes the clinical process and therefore is counterproductive. And by analogy, we argue we should tried to apply that logic in the courtroom, drawing this distinction between blame as a judgment of responsibility for something that has been defined as a crime versus blame as an affect. So basically thinking carefully about all the details of the criminal trial to try to keep affective blame as far as possible at bay. It's quite difficult because there's a certain genre of sort of hot retributive rhetoric that can be very powerful around criminal justice and sometimes even within the courtroom. But we think that this is really worth the effort to try to institutionalize this distinction between affective and detached blame. So in our later work, we sort of gone a bit further in a more ambitious direction, doing so on the basis not merely of the sort of normative aspiration here, but of evolutionary psychology, looking at the way in which both forgiveness aimed at reconciliation and anger leading to payback are long-standing human adaptations to conditions of violation and conflict. If someone wrongs us, we can blame and seek vengeance, or we can try to seek to motivate behavioural change and try to repair the relationship. Both responses characterise human practice in a range of different societies and circumstances. And we suggested that while we undoubtedly have a choice between the two, it seems very likely from a sort of social science comparative point of view that certain kinds of institutional conditions are much more favourable to the selection of reparative or forgiving rather than as opposed to vengeful reactions. What sorts of conditions? Well, psychologists argue that we're much more likely to choose, and seems very commonsensical, reconciliatory strategies in relation to those we regard as having what they call, it's a bit transactional, I'm sorry, associational value. In other words, people we expect to have to or want to associate with in the future, long-term relationships. So social arrangements which foster high and reasonably evenly distributed associational value, high levels of social trust in institutions, moderated levels of inequality, things that we struggle with, a range of political and social arrangements oriented to mutual respect and inclusion are more likely to foster reconciliatory responses. But other things being equal, and I accept that's a big caveat, there is strong reason, we think, to prefer reconciliatory to payback modalities for three reasons. The second is that the first is that they're less costly because they require less infrastructure and enforcement. Second, they're likely to be more robust over time because they cut out the obvious risk of cycles of revenge. And third, hence, they are better adapted to foster human capital and peaceable social relations. And that, we argued, gave us strong reason to think in terms of punishment oriented towards forgiveness. But how should we conceive forgiveness in the specific context of a large-scale impersonal institution like the criminal justice system? Clearly, not all conceptions of forgiveness would be suitable. But we found a conception which we thought was highly suitable to criminal justice, developed by a philosopher called Lacey, which thinks of forgiveness in terms of an orientation to wiping the slate clean. That's the idea. And we thought that was both appealing in itself and pretty well suited for our purposes. In the criminal justice context, a judgment of responsibility and hence detached blame would remain a precondition for a justified response to the violation and harmfulness of crime. But that response, both in itself and in terms of the modalities through which it would be delivered, would embody the commitment to wipe the state clean, and ideally to motivate behavioural change and rebuild relations between offender and society. And we argued that this obviously, though ideally accompanied by remorse and a desire for reconciliation on the part of the offender, should actually be built into the orientation of the criminal justice system rather than being institutionally conditional on that attitude on the offender's part. In other words, we were thinking of trying to conceive of the whole institution as oriented ideally to forgiveness. It's not abolition, but it's an orientation to forgiveness. Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of skeptical questions that can be asked about this position, about the particular conception of forgiveness. Of course, it's one of many in the philosophical canon, about the advisability and feasibility of banishing affective blame from the criminal process, about the role of victims, which we have written on separately, and about the political feasibility of any such rethinking and reworking. But I now want to turn to the second set of questions I flagged up at the beginning, on which we haven't written very much so far, and that is the question of whether it can make sense to reconceive a legal, political, institutionalized, largely professionalized, large-scale social practice in terms initially developed in relation to and practiced within interpersonal life. And even if it may make sense to develop institutionally specific concepts of certain concepts put to work in interpersonal ethical life, respect would be another obvious example, recently written about by Gabrielle Watson. Can this be true of a concept such as forgiveness, which is so intimately tied up with the moral emotions? Now, we would certainly acknowledge that not all concepts developed primarily in relation to interpersonal ethical life would find easy expression in institutional counterparts. For example, just to take an example of forgiveness, intersubjective, psychological forgivingness, a feeling of forgiveness, a subjective attitude of forgiveness, for instance, on the part of a sentencer or a victim, cannot be imposed, it can't be institutionally designed. What we're thinking in terms of is more producing an institution that makes the having of that, the developing of that subject attitude more likely to happen. And we think it's fair enough to describe that as it were, the institutional counterpart of an interpersonal disposition to forgivingness. And this isn't so radical when you think about, and I'm going to switch to my legal hat for a moment, when you think about how often the law does actually borrow from concepts in interpersonal life and ethical life, trust, respect, even the very concept of person or responsibility, illustrates both that once concepts are reworked in law, they take on a distinctive meaning. They no longer have quite the same meaning that they have simply in moral discourse, but they're always doing it all the time. But of course, the big question is, should we do it and what difference will it make empirically? And that I will come back to at the end, because I think there's a huge amount of work still needing to be done on that. Before I get there, let me just say a little bit more materially about what a criminal justice system oriented to forgiveness might look like and what it would not look like. I'm going to first I'll sketch first a set of existing or possible practices which either are or I think could be designed and practiced so as to maximize the capacity of the criminal justice system to express, in effect, a forgiving disposition before turning second to features of the criminal justice system which would have to be abandoned or radically rethought so as to excise their stigmatizing and unforgiving qualities. So, in contemplating the possibility of the criminal justice system oriented to forgiveness, we don't, in fact, start from a blank sheet, and that's in part thanks to the work of people like Alison. For example, many criminal justice systems have long featured the institution of pardon, and you could describe pardon as the institutional expression of forgiveness in a way par excellence. That isn't to say, as Leo and I learnt very interestingly from a fantastic thesis that we examined here last year by Giordana Campagna, that isn't to say that pardon always comes in the same form. It isn't always really about forgiveness in the deep sense. Things are much more complicated than that, but it is an institutional mechanism that wipes the slate clean, even if sometimes it's used for, in effect, political purposes. We know that pardons have been used to bolster sovereign and political authority, or to demonstrate, mercy, to again bolster authority, to secure political favour, to quell social conflict, all sorts of pragmatic reasons. But in all cases, it does in effect meet Allay's definition of wiping the slate clean. Only the last of those, the quelling social conflict one, really goes deeper in terms of the ambition to put aside resentment in an effort to rebuild and repair relations. But certainly, defined and constrained in specific ways, pardons can function as a key mechanism of forgiveness in criminal justice. A second and more varied set of institutions which could be designed, executed, and understood in terms of forgiveness in our sense are those associated with therapeutic jurisprudence, things like problem-solving courts, some forms of youth justice, and drug courts. Now, this in a way brings me back to the original point I made a few minutes ago about the slight difficulty in motivating an adequate dialogue between people who are thinking about the principles on which these sorts of institutions should be based and those who are very often developing them as community-based projects with bits and pieces of funding from a mix of charities and government and sometimes transnational organisations of one kind or another. But I think building that dialogue is really important. And all these institutions are interesting from my point of view because they all share the feature of a future orientation to behavioural change, to rebuilding relations, to helping those who violated others and breached social norms, sometimes very often harming themselves in the process, to acknowledge responsibility to change, to repair their relationship with society. The normative frameworks of responsibility without blame and of punishment conceived as oriented to forgiveness can, I hope, help us to build a clearer view of the foundations and priorities of those sorts of institutions, as well as perhaps identifying some of their limits. Restorative justice, I've already mentioned, is perhaps the most fully theorised and commonly practised form of criminal justice institution, ostensibly consistent with an orientation to forgiveness. But here too, I think the responsibility without blame, without punishment as forgiveness model has some key implications for how restorative justice should be designed and practiced. For example, it would dictate very careful protocols, which are indeed in place in many actual criminal restorative justice systems, constraining the way in which an appeal to shaming should go forward. I've always remembered, never forgotten, John Braithwaite telling a very searingly painful story against himself of a conference that in Canberra where the parties came to an agreement that the appropriate mediated outcome for an offender who'd been shoplifting was that a young man that he would have to go to the local shopping mall at the weekend wearing a T-shirt saying "I am a thief." Now, this was obviously not where John Braithwaite wanted restorative justice to be taking people, but that is the sort of risk of restorative justice, and clearly Hannah Pickard's and my model of punishment as oriented to forgiveness would be very cautious about shaming, about that kind of stigmatization, and for that reason would be very keen to see a fairly well controlled and structured form of restorative justice where it is impossible for the more articulate or powerful party to have a sort of disproportionate impact on the outcome. So if forms of restorative justice that give a very key role to victims in deciding the outcome, I think are not compatible with our view, because central to our view is that punishment still remains the responsibility of the state as marking a legal wrong to society as a whole and not simply to the victim. Now, of course, that of course vindicates the victim's right not to be violated or harmed through crime, but it decisively does not express the victim's personal interest, in our view, in their offender's punishment. Without justice and recognition for victims, the chances of institutionalizing and commanding political and popular support for punishment and forgiveness are very, very remote. And it's for that reason, as well as because of its intrinsic fairness, that we advocate a completely separate track for victims providing support and reparation independently of the criminal justice system, which we think is much more likely to produce what victims actually need. And I must say, I feel particularly eloquent about this week because we're sitting here in a country that has been having a heart-rending debate about decent treatment in the criminal justice system for victims of crime, quite rightly, for many decades. A student of mine came to see me the other day, very distressed. He was a victim of an assault a few months ago, and he just had his summons to court. The first thing that this reads is warning notice. He's just been summoned as a witness, as a victim, but it comes as a warning notice, just as if he'd done something wrong. I mean, yeah, how can we still be doing that? It's just unbelievable. And I think that is a sort of real problem of trying to deal with victims through criminal justice institutions. But more positively, I think punishment as forgiveness does resonate with many of the concerns of restorative justice, particularly, I'm thinking here of people like Shad Maruna's work on how rituals of reconciliation, or Meredith Rossner's work, rituals of reconciliation, reintegration and redemption can be made to work. I think that's an incredibly important empirical agenda. Another much less fully researched possibility suggested by the idea of punishment-oriented forgiveness would be, beginning to be a debate about this, a more dialogic approach to sentencing. If it's important for us to have agency and responsibility at the core of our practice of conviction and punishment, then maybe it makes sense not to have the offender as quite such a passive actor at the sentencing stage. So a response to crime oriented to wiping the slate clean has perhaps more chance of achieving its ends where the offender has been brought not only to take responsibility for their offence, but also to, at some level, accept the suitability of the response. Again, this seems to me to be something wide open for more empirical research, but common sense would suggest that a less sort of de haut en bas, more dialogic process could be helpful here. But let me return finally to the sort of limits of the question of the limits of this model, which I touched on briefly a few minutes ago. And to reiterate that punishment as forgiveness is not the same as abolition. For those who refuse responsibility or repeatedly reject social reconciliation, I personally think it's hard to see how societies can entirely dispense with more coercive, less dialogic measures. But what I do think, and this is the point of punishment-oriented forgiveness, that should always be seen as the second best, as a backup, even as a sort of failure, a social failure, moral failure. And that even when we get to that second best or nth best point, the mechanisms that leave the door to forgiveness and reconciliation need to be left open. So where a constraining and coercive sanction seems unavoidable, it nonetheless needs to be designed so as to maximize the chances of change and minimise alienation and degradation. So the work that you and Ben and others have been doing, Alison, on the quality of prison regimes is just absolutely central. I know some of you have been visiting a prison today, and I'm sure you've come out with a sort of really, embodied, visceral sense of how important the quality of the regime is to the reality of life in prison and the chances of people coming out of that, whole and able to manage their lives more effectively. And I think that can be true even of the very most serious offenders. And I'm thinking back here to the famous book by Jimmy Boyle that many of you will have read, Sense of Freedom, which was about, anybody, has anybody not read it? Oh, okay. So Boyle was a very, very, he was somebody who got involved in violent crime very young, and by the time he was in his 20s, he found himself in high security unit in Barlinnie prison in Glasgow. I think not at all like the prison you were visiting this afternoon. And he and a few other men became so unmanageable that they had actually had to be put in cages within their cells. It was just absolutely grim problem for prison management. And a very, very brave and innovative prison governor turned the high security unit into a self-governing wing of the prison and sort of handed governance responsibility over to the prisoners. I think there were something like 11 of them. I think a couple of them just couldn't cope at all, had to be taken out. But for those like Boyle, who could cope with it, could take the responsibility, it was life-changing. So that's one hopeful example. Now, to come to the other side of the coin, it is, of course, unfortunately, much easier to come up with things, a lengthy list of things that at the moment the criminal justice system does that are not compatible in any way with the idea of punishment being oriented to forgiveness. So if we're concerned about minimising stigma and affective blaming in the courtroom, the prison, the probation office, the community service programme, there's a lot that we could be doing better, I think. Let's start with the trial. One thing that is sort of taken for granted still pretty much in this country is the use of the dock. It has an incredible, for those of you who've been in a courtroom for a criminal trial, it has an incredible sort of impact psychologically, seeing somebody, particularly if they're brought up from the cells in handcuffs, so particularly if they say they've been remanded in custody, and of course the remand in custody in itself is quite a difficult institution, given that we technically operate on a presumption of innocence. But you could certainly argue that having an offender in the dock is not, or let alone a sort of cage, which happens in some courts, not here, I think, but in some countries. We'll see, the late Lacey in a cage in a Russian courtroom. This is just not best framing for a trial process oriented to wiping the slate clean, even following conviction. I think some features of criminal law and evidence too are quite badly in tension with an orientation to forgiveness. So some systems have relatively unconstrained admissibility of character evidence, and in our English and Welsh criminal justice system, we have actually expanded the admissibility of character evidence in the last few years. And that, I think, is somewhat worrying, because I think that character evidence can be highly prejudicial and highly stigmatizing. We also know from a lot of socio-legal work, ethnographic work over the years, that the highly technical quality of criminal procedure in many is incredibly unhelpful for all the lay participants in the courtroom. It can be an incredibly alienating experience being a witness, and I imagine for many offenders it's a very alienating experience going through a trial. And then another thing that we would be very dubious about, although the boat may already have sailed on this one, is emotive victim impact statements. In this country, there are at least pretty clear guidelines for what can go into victim impact statements, but that isn't the case in all systems, and that seems to be something that invites judges to engage in their occasional a taste for sort of moralising rhetoric at the sentencing stage, which we don't think we think carries quite a big risk of stigmatisation. Moving to the execution of sentence, again, some very obvious reforms are indicated by this model. Features of community penalty regimes which precisely seek to stigmatise offenders, making them wear high-vis jackets or very visible tags, seem obvious no-nos. Penalties that close the door to reconciliation, whole life prison terms, would be out on this model. Prison regimes too, as I've already mentioned, should reproduce features so far as possible of civic respect, decent living conditions and opportunities for work, education and relevant therapies. And equally important, a raft of supplementary measures attendant on conviction called to be urgently reconsidered instead of quietly being expanded the whole time. So post-sentence disqualifications in employment, licensing and association. Disenfranchisement during and after a prison sentence perhaps represents the most sort of radical example of a penalty incompatible with the criminal justice system that claims to be oriented to wiping the slate clean. I was looking recently at a bill on, I can't even remember what it was on, it might have been one of the new public order bills, and I found tucked in some tiny section 350 a ban on people who've had IPPs marrying, some extraordinary thing like that. You just think, where did that come from? What a completely crazy
It's
idea.
in the Victims and Prisoners Bill.
It is, isn't it?
It's still there.
I just couldn't believe, I thought, I can't pinch myself. I'm so glad, thank you, Nikki, because as I said it, even Alison was looking skeptical, I thought, am I making this up? But I want to come back to this theme of the so-called Christmas card bill and act, Christmas tree act, in a moment, because I think it's apposite. Anyway, in short, to summarise that last section of my paper before I just say a few final remarks about future projects. Even in a criminal justice system not yet oriented to forgiveness by some distance, a significant amount could be done to reduce counterproductive stigmatisation and to mitigate the disintegrative and human capital destroying dynamics of affective blame. So let me just close by saying a few words about where I'd like to take this next. I think there are two ways in which this project has some relevance beyond criminal justice. And one is a sort of legal theory, legal philosophy kind of project, and the other is a more institutional one, and that they relate to each other. So let me evoke the institutional one first, because it's very easy to describe. Masses of social institutions can, I think, aptly be described in terms like having a forgiving disposition or a caring disposition or that sort of disposition. I've been spending over the last couple of years, a lot of time in a care home. My mother has been moved into one, and that's an experience that many of us in the room either will have or have had. And we all know that institutions can feel certain ways, and that really matters to the quality of life of people in those institutions. And I think that means that this project of thinking about how institutions work in terms of sort of background ideas and values is actually pretty useful. It's of course also really important that the realization of those values depends very often on some very, very detailed protocols and tiny conventions of behavior, which can be, to some extent understood independently of the values. But I think having a commitment to those sorts of ideas and principles is actually a really important thing. And if we think of, I was thinking about sort of other sort of criminal justice adjacent institutions like the Redemption Roasters or Timpson's shoe. Does everybody know about Timpson's, the Timpson Foundation? Anybody know? You all know about it. I must say I found out about it to my shame relatively recently, but that sort of thing seems important to me. But here's the converse thing. This is what I had originally intended to talk about this, but I'm not as far on with it as I'd like to be. I'm going to have to be quite far on with it by June because I have to give a lecture on it. But I've become really interested in what seems to me to be a bit of a revival of interest, certainly in legal scholarship, but also to some extent in case law, on ideas like forgiveness, respect, hope, trust, loyalty. And I'm going to try and work out where I think that's coming from, why it might be important. And this brings me back to the Christmas tree acts. If I think back, so when I was studying law originally sort of 40 odd years ago, it was fairly easy to tell very quickly what a piece of legislation was about, mainly. They usually had some kind of description of what their approach was, what their ambition was, and even if they sometimes got some other things stuck on, you could pretty much see what they were about from what it said on the tin. Theft Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Race Relations Act. So this goes well beyond criminal justice. But particularly in criminal justice, but not only in criminal justice, the style of legislation has changed massively. We have gone in for this very politicized, reactive, huge bill legislation with lots of appendices, making scope, lots of delegated legislation. To the point where it's really hard to make sense of regulatory environments. And I'm sort of wondering whether that is in part why people are beginning to reach back for these bigger ideas to try and make sense of what we do when we bring in new laws. But also whether there is really enough known empirically about what the upshot of this changing style of legislation and regulation is. I think, all of our experience in the pandemic was a very interesting sort of thought experiment in a way about this. I remember I teach a first year course on introduction to legal systems, and I always try to give them some current real life examples. And during the pandemic, I thought I'd use the Coronavirus Act. So I go through the Coronavirus Act, and again, I get to about section 350 before I get to the one I'm interested in, which says the potential control of potentially infected persons, in other words, the curfews and the restrictions. And it simply says, see appendix, whatever. And that simply tells us that what we all experienced in the pandemic, which the rules kept changing because they've all been made by ministers who haven't really thought out their strategy. And so I think there's something interesting going on here, and I hope to be able to tell you more about it on a future occasion. But thank you so much for listening.